Okay, let's, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. So, in the Bible study, they've been going through, sort of systematically through Genesis, and in some cases, taking a theme or a significant event, and going over that, and not so much verse by verse. But actually, I think tonight, because the chapter that we're looking at is Genesis chapter 20, it will be helpful because there's not a lot of significant events that are taking place or a major theme that, we're going to cover over 40 minutes. So I think what I want to do is read the chapter, and then I want to go through it kind of verse by verse, and then at the end take some sort of reflection, spiritual reflections for us, like what we can take from the text in a more practical way. So I'm going to go ahead and read. And I'm reading from the Orthodox Study Bible, Old Testament version, which is going to be similar to the New King James Version, but might be slightly different. So I'm going to read from this text, and you can follow along in whatever version you're using. Now Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned among the Gerarites. Then Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister," for he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," lest at a given time the men of the city should kill him because of her. Now Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, "O Lord, will you destroy an ignorant and just nation? Did he not say to me, 'She is my sister'? And did she not say to me, 'He is my brother'? I did this thing with a clean heart and righteous hands." Then God said to him in a dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clean heart, and I spared you that you might not sin against me. Therefore I did not allow you to touch her. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, rest assured you shall die, you and all who are yours." So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told all these things in their hearing. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done." Again Abimelech said to Abraham, "What possessed you to do this thing?" Abraham replied, "Because I thought, surely the worship of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife. But indeed she truly is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not of my mother, and she became my wife. So it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This righteousness shall you do for me. In every place we enter, say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took 1,000 pieces of silver, sheep, oxen, and male and female servants, and gave them to Abraham, and he restored Sarah his wife to him. Thus Abimelech said to Abraham, 'See, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you.' Then to Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver, which will vindicate your honor before all those with you. But tell the truth in all things.' So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants. Then they bore children, for the Lord closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. And glory be to the Holy Trinity forever. Amen." So it's a very interesting chapter. Last week, I think Tony covered in detail the account of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so in this chapter, we see Abraham is continuing sort of this pilgrimage, this journey that he's on. And he enters into this place called Gerar, the Gerarites. And it's interesting that the scriptures say that, so the word Gerarites or Gerar means like lodging place, like the Hebrew word means lodging place. But it's interesting that it says between Kadesh and Shur. Now, if you're familiar with the Arabic, right, Kadesh is very similar to the word Kudus or holy, and Shur is very similar to Shar, which means evil. So in a sense, Abraham is between good and evil. Abraham is lodging himself, we could say, and needs to choose between good and evil. And there's a lot of sort of morals to this event. about this sort of interesting reverse between Abraham, who was supposed to be the righteous prophet of God. Actually, this is the first chapter that the word prophet is used. And yet it is a pagan leader, Abimelech, who turns out to be the more righteous person. And that's something that we kind of see in this chapter, is that Abraham has a problem that repeats itself. And this is the second time it's repeated itself, where he, as a way of sort of manifesting a lack of trust in God and the promises of God, he's sort of telling this half lie. He tries to vindicate himself by saying, well, she actually is sort of my half-sister because we have the same father. In those days, they didn't yet have the marriage laws that prevented sort of those close familial intermarriage relationships, which would come later. But clearly, when you look at the context of what's happening and how many have commented on this story, Abraham is manifesting a lack of trust in God. And that's something that happened in chapter 12. I don't know who covered that story, where, again, the same thing happened with Pharaoh, and Abraham lied about Sarah, saying that she is his sister. And what's interesting is that in that event, Sarah was 65 years old. So one could argue that at 65 years old, she was still very beautiful, and therefore very much a beautiful sort of figure that Pharaoh or a leader would want sort of to take for himself. But at this time, she's 90 years old, right? And so, some have asked the question, okay, we all wish that at 90 years old, we look decent, but at what point does a 90-year-old woman really attract that kind of... So there are two sort of thoughts on that, and I know I'm kind of going out of line here, but one thought is that that when God promised that she would give birth to the seed of Abraham, to Isaac, which comes actually in the next chapter, that he sort of infused her with a certain beauty, a certain youthfulness, until the promise of the birth of Isaac was to be fulfilled. And so that she indeed appeared to be very, very beautiful, even at the age of 90. Another, perhaps, theory is just that because people lived in those days, according to some of these early chapters in Genesis, to much longer periods, that at 90 years old, someone still had a certain youthfulness to them that was still attractive and sought after. In any case, I think we can say that there was something in Sarah, something beautiful in Sarah, that Abraham felt threatened by when he entered into this region. Now, in that time, all of the tribes would have known each other. So Abraham would have been known as somebody who was very wealthy. He had a lot of possessions and cattle and properties and things like that. And so it's not that Abimelech wouldn't have known or heard about Abraham, which is maybe one of the reasons why Abraham was worried, because he knew that his reputation perhaps preceded him. So what I want to do now is just kind of go through the chapter. I mean, we read it all the way through, and just kind of look at it verse by verse or passage by passage, and then take some practical things from it. So, again, now Abraham journeyed from there to the south and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned among the Gerarites. So again, we said that this area is a Canaanite area. So these are pagan people. They do not worship the God of Abraham. And Abraham is, again, on sort of this pilgrimage, right? He's sojourning from place to place. And we don't know exactly why at this point he's moving to this area. Perhaps after what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah, and he saw sort of the destruction that had taken place, he just felt the need to move to a different region. But in any case, again, spiritually, we could look at these words, Kadesh and Shur, and see that there's sort of a hidden spiritual meaning there about good and evil that we're going to see, again, sort of a choice that Abraham faces and ultimately related to his trust in God. Then Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister," for he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," lest at a given time the men of the city should kill him because of her. Now Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So again, 90 years old, it's sort of an interesting incident as to why at 90 years old she would have been such a threat, as one to be taken. But again, in those days, this was not a matter of sort of like lust necessarily. Because in those days, the harem, the number of women that were part of your possessions was a sign of your strength. And that's why Solomon had thousands of wives, or harem, and it's not because, he needed that many sort of women in his life romantically, but it was a sign of power. It was a sign of strength. It was a sign of having something that one of your neighboring kings or tribal leaders doesn't have. And so it's sort of like, unfortunately, I know in today's time these things sound very offensive, but in those days, it's the number of women that a leader had, the number of wives or harem that he had, would have been like the number of cattle or the amount of gold or silver and other possessions. So that could have been another reason why he wanted, he took Sarah to be his own. The word Abimelech actually is sort of a generic, it means my father is king. So a lot of commentators don't actually believe this is his name. They think it's more of a title or sort of a generic reference to the leader of that area. But again, it's not so important to the story, but just maybe an interesting point. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, "Indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now, it's interesting, God sort of, he appears to a pagan, right? God is showing himself to Abimelech. He's not part of, this nation that he's calling through Abraham. And over again in the Bible, we see this, that God, in order to fulfill his plan, in order to fulfill his will amongst us as a people, as a mankind and as a world, he will not stop to make sure that his will is accomplished. And so he even appears to non-believers, to pagans, in order for his will to be fulfilled. And so he comes to Abimelech and in a sense threatens him or calls him a dead man because he took a woman that is actually the wife of somebody and not simply his sister. Now, why is God so? Why so drastic? What's at stake here? This is really kind of a big point of the story. Why is it so important that Sarah be sort of untouched? Because of Isaac, exactly. In other words, God made a promise that that Isaac, the seed of Abraham, right, would come through Abraham and Sarah. And if Sarah was touched by another man, then there would be a doubt or a confusion as to whether the child born of hers was really the child of promise. And so, again, it's interesting when God has a plan, right, nothing will stop that plan. And so and interestingly, as we see in the story, God actually takes credit. He says, yes, I kept you from touching her. I kept you from sinning against me and taking her in as your wife. because again, it is very important. Now, shows, again, one of the areas where Abraham faltered, right? Abraham didn't trust that the promise of God, that the promised seed of Abraham was going to come through Sarah in her old age. So he should have trusted that that plan would have been fulfilled and not out of fear lied about Sarah, as he did in Genesis chapter 12, in the same scenario with Pharaoh, right? So Abraham clearly here is still being formed in his relationship with God, is still being tested, and still, of course, the ultimate test is going to come with the slaughter of Isaac. And of course, at that time, Abraham will pass the test. But here we see a saint in the making, right? Which is, again, a point that we'll come to at the end, that all of us are like Abraham, we're always an in-progress project of God's. So it was necessary for God sort of to take this drastic measure and to preserve Sarah from being touched by anyone other than her husband Abraham. Now Abimelech had not come near her and said, "O Lord, will you destroy an ignorant and just nation? Did he not say, 'She is my sister'? And did she not say to me, 'He is my brother'? I did this thing with a clean heart and righteous hands." Right? So Abimelech is in the right. He didn't do anything wrong. He believed Abraham's word. And not only Abraham, but it's clear that Sarah also said, "He is my brother." What's also interesting in the story is that never is Sarah blamed for saying, "He is my brother." Why is that? Well, again, just as in those days, the women were totally submissive to their husbands, Sarah had no choice. Right? I mean, Sarah, her husband told her, "When you go, you have to say, that I'm your brother," and she had to obey. So she's not blamed. Abraham should have known better. So really the interplay is between Abraham and Abimelech, and Sarah is innocent. She's innocent at every level of this. So Abimelech was a righteous man. He has a very strong conscience. This is a very important aspect of the Bible, is that there is a natural law that you see throughout the Bible. Right? It's not just those who receive the law from God that have a sense of right and wrong, but the pagan nations, they themselves also have a sense of right and wrong. So there is something that we call the natural law. No one can escape the natural law, right? And even St. Paul talks about how unbelievers and those who never heard the gospel, they will be judged according to the natural law, the things that are sort of known to the conscience of man by simply being human, and something that's sort of instilled in our humanity, coming forth from the hands of God. We have this natural law. Of course, we have the elevated divine law, the revelatory law of God, but nonetheless, there is a natural law that exists. And so Abimelech clearly, through the natural law, manifests a greater righteousness than Abraham, who has been called by God. And that's really sort of the striking, element of this chapter. Then God said to him in a dream, "Yes, I know you did this with a clean heart." So look, even God vindicates Abimelech. "And I spared you that you might not sin against me. Therefore, I did not allow you to touch her." Right? So it's very interesting that God here protected Abimelech. He gave him a grace to not sin against him. Right? And this is, I think, a very beautiful thing for us, that God sees the intentions of our hearts. He reads the motives that we have. And when he sees a pure intention or a good motive, he gives us the grace. And he gives it to all people, even, again, those that were outside of the covenant. God is very just. And so for every good intention, for every pure heart that exists, God is working, and God is providing an element or a manifestation of his grace. Um, so again, God stops Abimelech. He gives him a special grace not to sin against God and against Abraham in order to preserve the promise of Isaac coming from Sarah through the seed of Abraham. So yeah, the striking thing I would say here is that this pagan is teaching the righteous man a lesson. And this is the very sort of humbling thing about this event in Abraham's life. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, rest assured you shall die, you and all who are yours. So this is the first time actually in the Bible the word prophet is used, and it's referred to Abraham. You normally don't think of Abraham as a prophet. You know, we talk about him as the patriarch. And so this very early usage of the word prophet tells us that, you know, prophet is not just somebody who, you know, tells the future, predicts things, because Abraham is not doing that. But a prophet is one who, in a sense, is a representative of God, who speaks on God's behalf, and in this case, who prays for someone. So God, it's very beautiful to see that even though Abraham is at fault, and Abraham is manifesting a lack of trust, but for God, Abraham is still his chosen one. Abraham is still righteous. And so even though Abimelech is in the right, God is saying, Abraham is going to pray for you, and you will live, and your family will be blessed. So Abraham is called a prophet, and sorry, there's a gnat flying right around me. And he is going to pray for Abimelech and for his household. So there's this sort of reversal now, right? Abimelech is now the one who is, in a sense, carrying the greatest fear. At first, Abraham was afraid, and Abimelech was sort of in the position of power, and now, when God has sort of manifested who Abraham is in God's eyes, it's sort of reversed, right? And so, again, there's sort of this beautiful presentation of the one who is blessed by God is always in a position of authority and power, right? And that applies to all of us, right? If any one of us who lives a life that is pleasing to God and tries to live according to God's blessing, we will always have the support of God's grace and authority in our lives. And we see that maybe most drastically in any sort of confrontation between good and evil. You know, the righteous man against any sort of demonic or evil forces. Not because the man in and of himself possesses power, but because he possesses the power of God. So when we hear about, for example, you know, a simple monk in a monastery doing exorcisms, right? Again, it's not because this monk is holier than any other monk or any other person necessarily, but because he has the blessing of God, he has the authority of God, the power of God working through him, and no matter how many thousands of demonic forces come up against him, they will never be able to overcome him. So in this case, again, Abraham still possesses that cherished relationship with God. And so God still promises, even though Abraham again is faltering in his trust and in his faith, but God nonetheless is promoting Abraham as still his righteous child in the front of this pagan king. So Abimelech rose early in the morning, called all his servants, and told all these things in their hearing, and the men were very much afraid. So now all of the people are afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us? How have I offended you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You have done deeds to me that ought not to be done." So again, Abimelech is in the right. He's chastising the righteous Abraham. He is in the right. The holy man of God is in the wrong, and Abimelech sort of gives it to him. Again, Abimelech said to Abraham, "What possessed you to do this thing?" Abraham replied, "Because I thought, surely the worship of God is not in this place, and they will kill me on account of my wife." So again, what's Abraham's excuse for lying, or for telling a half lie, or at least being deceptive? He was afraid. It was fear, right? And we can all think about how much fear motivates us to do things or to not do things that we should or shouldn't do. But Abraham should have, again, trusted in God and in the promises of God, and therefore those promises of God should have led him to believe that no earthly king or leader is going to thwart God's will or thwart his plan with Sarah. "Indeed, she truly is my sister." Now look, Abraham is still vindicating himself, right? He's still saying, "Well, technically I didn't lie. She is the daughter of my father, but not my mother, and she became my wife. So I just left part of it out. I didn't mention she's my wife, but I just mentioned she's my sister," which is still partially true. So again, you still see where Abimelech is sort of possessing he's in the moral right. He has a sort of a moral high position above Abraham, and Abraham is still sort of cowering in his position. Again, a sign of his lack of confidence in God to protect him and to protect Sarah. And also a reminder for us that a half-truth said with the intent to deceive is still a lie, right? And this is one of the things that we need, obviously to be sensitive to in our own lives. How often, and because communication is increased so much between us, we have telephone calls, we have text messages, we have social media. So there is a lot more opportunity for us to say half-truths, to be deceptive, to present a picture that's not accurate about something. And so, there's a warning here about integrity and about honesty and truthfulness. "So it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her," now it's interesting, so Abraham he's vindicating himself, but now actually he's blaming God, right? This expression, "God caused me to wander." I did some very interesting research on this verse. This word that he uses, to wander, apparently is used in the Old Testament about 50 times. And in all of those times, it's used in a negative sense. Like a stray animal that wanders away. There are 6 other words that Abraham could have used that are in a more positive light. In other words, what he's saying here, he's telling Abimelech, he's like, "Look, God made me to sort of get lost in this. He sent me on this journey where I have no idea where I'm going. It's his fault. He's the reason why I'm in this position." Right? He's presenting this pilgrimage or this sojourn in a negative way. He's blaming God. "So it came to pass when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This righteousness shall you do for me, in every place we enter, say of me, he is my brother.'" So he's saying, because God asked me to do this difficult thing and asked me to do this maybe ridiculous thing, so you're gonna cover for me and participate in this lie. Right? So again, there's a warning here for us that when God asks of us something difficult, when we try to follow a commandment or any of the gospel precepts that are not easy, we can also fall into that sort of justification. Well, it's God's fault. He's expecting me to do this, right? Or we can think of some difficult circumstance we're facing in our family, our marriage, with our children, and so we take liberty to sin in another way, and we say, well, it's because I'm trying to please this person, and it's impossible to please them, so I'm entitled to do this other thing. And you can sort of fill in the blanks with whatever that might be. But it's this idea that, again, Abraham is sort of throwing it back on God as being the reason why he had to lie. And the more, of course, we are accustomed to living a dishonest or a sinful life, the more we tend to blame everybody else around us for all of our woes and for all of our problems, and we are always the victim. Then Abimelech took 1,000 pieces of silver, sheep, oxen, and male and female servants, and gave them to Abraham, and he restored Sarah, his wife, to him. Now again, it's really amazing that Abimelech, who is in the right, he is innocent, he is really the righteous one in this story. And what does he do? He turns around and with great kindness and generosity, he lavishes on Abraham all these gifts. He basically says, take whatever you want, that's mine. So not only does he return Sarah, but along with returning Sarah to Abraham, he lets Abraham take his choice of the land, the silver, and of course in those days, the way one bartered or the way one possessed something was through sheep and oxen and silver and wives. Sorry. But really, who should have been giving who a gift? I mean, Abraham should have said, here, ha, kakaleya, take this, I'm sorry, let's call it even. But Abimelech is the one who is, again, sort of showing this wonderful virtue of generosity and kindness. Thus Abimelech said to Abraham, see, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. Then to Sarah he said, behold, I have given you your brother 1,000. It's very interesting. He actually calls Sarah, he says, behold, I have given what? Your brother, right? So he's like, I'm not going to embarrass you. You want to say he's your brother, and he says you're mesh. It's okay. Tell your brother or give this to your brother. You almost see this sort of gentleness, this nobility, this noble character of Abimelech, where he goes along with it and says, look, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver, which will vindicate, in the Orthodox study Bible says, the translation says, which will vindicate your honor before all those with you. So he's also very concerned about vindicating Sarah, and making sure that she is innocent in all of this, that she comes out sort of unscathed. But then he says, but tell the truth in all things. Right? Who's teaching who? Right? And this is a good lesson for us. We can learn from everyone. We should never think that because we're Christians that our pagan neighbor or our unbelieving co-worker has nothing to offer us. The humble person can learn from an animal. The humble person can take correction from anyone. He sees himself as nothing, and therefore he sees everyone as better than himself, and therefore he's open to being corrected or to receive instruction from anyone. So, how are we on time? 7:04. We have 5 minutes? Okay. So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants. Then they bore children, for the Lord closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So not only did God prevent Abimelech from touching Sarah, but he prevented all of the wombs of the house of Abimelech from being able to bear children until Abraham prayed for him. So there's a lot that we can take from just this verse or these two verses. Of course, the power of intercessory prayer we see very powerfully. As a matter of fact, in this chapter, two things happen for the first time in the Bible. The word prophet and that somebody's praying for somebody is the first time it happens in this chapter. Very interesting. 20 chapters into the Bible, those are the first time those two concepts are introduced. And so the first time prayer is mentioned in the Bible, it's in the context of intercessory prayer. Abraham will pray for you, and then I will act. So if we ever needed evidence of the prayer of a righteous man availeth much, that St. James says, right? It's there early on in the Bible. God is basically saying, I will act when Abraham prays for you. And that's something that we see in so many of the lives of the saints, right? Where God sort of honors the saints by saying, I will do this thing because you asked of it, because you have offered your life to me, because you have sacrificed so much for me, because you have honored me and glorified me before all people. Therefore, I will honor you by responding positively to your request. And I think this is how we see some of the saints sort of act with such spontaneity, where they sort of on demand proclaim somebody as being healed or pregnant or whatever it might be, because they've sort of received that grace from God, that He hears their prayers. In one of the Psalms it says that the Lord's ears are bent; they're bent to the words of the righteous, or to the prayers of the righteous. It's a beautiful image where God is sort of like closely leaning in and listening to the prayers of the righteous people. So just to maybe wrap up, what are some sort of takeaways from this chapter? Even the best human examples of the Bible are imperfect, right? God is always showing us examples of imperfect people that are a sort of work in progress, right? And this should give us hope. God doesn't begin with the perfect. He doesn't begin with, somebody who's different than the rest of humanity, but He begins oftentimes with the weakest and with the lowliest of people in order to show us the power of His grace and the power of His life working through each person. Another thing that we see is that every one of us has a predominant sin, a predominant weakness that sort of comes up again over and over again in confession. And Abraham seems to have this predominant sin of not being truthful. Isaac will do the same thing later. So we should be aware of our predominant sin, our predominant weakness, and give special attention to it, special prayers for it, make sure we're honest about it in our confessions, and so on. And then the last thing I would maybe have us think about is this idea of pilgrimage, right? I mean, Abraham is presented so far as, this wandering, servant of God. And this is a beautiful image of each one of us, right? Each one of us is sort of this wandering servant of God in our lives until God brings us to the promised land, until He brings us to the fulfillment of His will. In the book of Hebrews, it says, chapter 11, verses 8 through 12, it speaks about the faith of Abraham, and it says, "It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance." Right? And we could say that this verse applies to all of us, that by faith we are called to listen to the voice of God, who is constantly calling us out to leave something or some place or some sin or some aspect of our life in order to go deeper and deeper into His will and into what His promise is for us, what is our inheritance that He wants to give us. So the Christian life is a constant pilgrimage. It's a constant sojourn. It's a constant sort of wandering seeking the grace of God's will to lead us to where he wants us to be. The word pilgrim in Latin literally means a foreigner. And so we as Christians, we live as foreigners, as sojourners, as pilgrims, as strangers in this land and in this body, because we know that this is not our final destination. The pilgrimage is not just something that takes place externally, but it is ultimately an inner pilgrimage, a pilgrimage in our hearts that lead us from sin to righteousness, from self-love to selfless love, from self-will to God's will, and so on. There's a constant movement that should be taking place in our heart, where we're leaving one place to arrive at another place. So we can see this concept very beautifully in the person of Abraham, and many of these chapters that we're focusing on him. Any comments, questions? Glory be to God forever. Amen. Should we just say, Our Father? Lord, make us worthy to pray thankfully, Our Father, who art